very serious criticism of the ICC is the role of the current prosecutor and the fact that all of the prosecutions so far are in Africa. And when you have a clear case of war crimes committed by the leadership of a Western European country, the prosecutor was unwilling to move. The case is perfectly clear. So what I would hope is that when the current inquiry is finished and reports, that perhaps the prosecutor will pluck up some courage and start an investigation.
So it all rests down on the courage or cowardice of a prosecutor, which sounds quite strange because clearly pressures can be brought to be borne on such individuals.
That's a system, and one hopes that there are going to be judges, prosecutors, people at the international level who actually care more for justice and international law than they do for keeping powerful countries happy.
Well, we started off with the case of Israeli officials, but now we're going on to powerful ex-British officials, naming people, perhaps including people like Tony Blair. Would you say that there is some real possibility that somebody like himself would come before a war tribunal at some point in the future?
Well, I was one of 8 professors of international law from 4 countries, including some pretty senior people. And we were brought together by peace rights, by public interest lawyers. They're the very people who've been taking these cases in relation to Iraq. We had an inquiry at the London School of Economics where we got to examine cluster bombs and all that kind of thing. And we heard witnesses. And we wrote a very careful and cautious and actually rather conservative report. Mm-hmm. But the clear conclusion was that there were grounds for investigating Tony Blair, Jeff Hoon and others, in particular for the use of cluster bombs during the invasion and occupation, amounting to war crimes. And
on what planet do you think such an investigation could actually lead to a prosecution, do you think? Do you think there is a likelihood of that?
It's the evidence which will prove it, is that on Iraq, particularly the last year or so, we've seen more evidence of the abuse by British forces that took place during the occupation, like the death of Baha Musa, which has just been thoroughly investigated. But we're now seeing the scale of that. The reason the ICC prosecutor gave it years ago for not investigating, although war crimes he admitted were committed, they hadn't reached the threshold for it to be serious enough for him to take it.
And did he actually say what that threshold would be?
He didn't quite, but we'll be challenging him now that the evidence is, the scale was in the hundreds. And then using the very principles of international criminal law of command responsibility, which is that those, not just who give the orders, but in a position of authority, who should have known about the crimes taking place and failed to prevent it, then you can start tracing the responsibility up the chain of command to the senior generals and perhaps to the politicians if it got to the stage where they should have known what was going on and failed to stop it.
So if I could just give a final word to Dr. Dawood Abdullah, who's been patiently on the line. What's your message to Muslims watching this programme? Because it's easy to get disheartened and think, well, some people always get away with it and there's no point in being engaged. Well, I'm so sorry to our viewers. Dawood Abdullah has had to leave, so I'll give the last word to yourself in terms of how can ordinary people not become disheartened in this process, and indeed, how can they help?
I think public opinion is enormously important. Actually, I would say that it's public opinion which is always decisive at the end of the day. And we know that there was an enormous sense of revulsion by a tremendous number of people with the invasion of Iraq. I think as more and more evidence comes out, by the way, on the question of threshold, I wrote the section of the report on threshold, and we very carefully went through all the principles and issues as to why the absolutely clear evidence which could not be contradicted of the use of cluster bombs near civilians amounted to very strong evidence for the commission of war crimes, but yet the prosecutor wouldn't go. I hope there's going to be a wave of public opinion in this country which will encourage the prosecutor to take the view that these people who are no longer in power, but where there's strong suspicion that they committed extremely serious crimes, that they should be investigated.
Well, you heard it on this programme. The investigations have been done. The evidence has clearly been collated. It's just a question of public opinion. So do make your voices heard and do join us at the same time next week. And don't forget, you can tweet as well as watch us on YouTube. Thank you very much.